Hi everyone. Just jumping in before the episode begins. Like I said last week, this is a little change of pace from our usual Scurry Season special episodes. Me and my friend Jon Molik of Headlines and History have been working on this collaboration episode for months now, and finally it's bore through. So, before I waffle on too much, Jon is a brilliant podcaster, and he has a brilliant podcast. So please show him some love. Normal service will resume next week, with the more creepier episodes. Also, the podcast of the week this week is our friends the Swerve podcast, but more about them later. I will link both shows in the description below. So without further ado, I give you the Battle of Saratoga, and more dark history.
Okay, welcome to our very special collab episode between myself, Jon Molik of Headlines and History.
And me, Rob Bradley, from Dark History. I'm glad we finally got over the line. I know it's been difficult to get this going, more so on my part.
Yeah, so for those of us that have been listening, and I've said numerous times, Rob and I have been planning on an episode that focuses on the Battle of Saratoga for a few different reasons. First, we love history, that one's obvious. And I live near the battlefield myself. I've been there, and I could talk about it from a personal perspective. And three, since I'm clearly American and Rob over there is a redcoat, we both thought it would be a pretty interesting discussion.
So today, we're travelling back to the 18th century to explore the Battle of Saratoga, a critical turning point in the American Revolution. As I said to you, Jon, before, us Brits tend to forget about this war, and we also get defensive over it as well.
Yeah, so that's right, Rob. The Battle of Saratoga wasn't just any battle. It was the decisive victory that convinced France to support the war for the American cause, fundamentally altering the course of the war. And your point about the Brits tending to forget the war seems obvious, but at the same time still shocks us a bit. And I say us. Why? Because Americans tend to be self-centered. And the revolution is the greatest victory in our country's history, led by arguably the greatest American ever. So, of course, we presuppose everyone else should be fascinated with the war. But Americans tend to forget we're a very young country compared to Britain. And our war is just another in a long line of colonial uprisings throughout British history. I say that not to be critical or antagonistic, but honest. The British Empire at one point controlled more land than any other in history. So why should we give the same value to the revolution as we would?
Like I said, Jon, we have such a long and storied history that, at the risk of sounding crass, it isn't that important. You've got to think that we have pubs older than your country. I can walk right now from my house 10 minutes to an inn that Oliver Cromwell stayed in during the English Civil War. It was around 1643, which is only 24 years after the Mayflower landed, never mind the Revolutionary War. When you factor in that we've had Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Danes, Normans all invade our country at most 600 years before the 13 colonies existed. We've had Canute the Great, William the Conqueror, Richard the Lionheart, Henry VIII, William Shakespeare, Charles Darwin, Sir Isaac Newton, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, Nelson, Churchill. We fought two civil wars, being the War of the Roses and the Royalists and the Parliamentarians. We fought crusades. We forged the empire that, to use the oldest cliché, the sun never set on. Had a plethora of rebellions, murder plots, royal scandals. We've been ruined as a country, built back up as a country, and the vast majority of this isn't taught to us. Focusing more on the war and the loss of America, it didn't affect us as a country at all. If anything, we prospered. We gained Australia, New Zealand, which had far more resources than the 13 colonies and Canada. The same can be said about South Africa, India and Hong Kong. Altogether, it gave us a lot of wealth, geopolitical power, and 100 plus years of solid growth. I'm sorry, America. Let's get back to the story. This battle marked the beginning of the end of British dominance in American colonies. But before we dive into the details, let's set the stage for a bit of context.
Yeah, good, Rob. Thanks for that long history that is clearly much longer than yours. But okay, good. The context. It's important to understand the state of the war before Saratoga. So the American Revolutionary War was sparked by growing tensions between the 13 colonies and Great Britain, as we've talked about, primarily due to issues of taxation without representation, British attempts to exert tighter control over the colonies, and imposition of punitive measures like the Intolerable Acts of 1774, the Coercive Acts to the Brits. These were a series of 4 laws passed by the British Parliament to punish the colony of Massachusetts Bay for the Boston Tea Party. Now, the 4 acts were the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, and the Quartering Act.
The Quartering Act is one of the most remembered, which required colonists to house British troops on their property. Not in their private homes, though, which the Americans often wrongly believed. They were housed in uninhabited buildings like outhouses or barns. Anyway, the colonies resented being taxed and governed by Parliament, in which they had no representation, leading to protests and acts of defiance, such as the Boston Tea Party. And we still haven't forgiven you for wasting all that tea. These conflicts escalated into desires of independence, culminating in the colonies' decision to fight for self-governance and break away from British rule.
Now listen, I'm not a fan of tea anyway, so I'll drink it, but I'm a coffee guy myself. But moving forward, by 1777, the British had captured key cities like New York and were pushing to split the colonies along the Hudson River, aiming to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. The move was a smart one on many levels. So tactically, it isolated American forces. Operationally, it would have forced the Americans to rethink supply. And strategically, it would have killed morale from the lowest private to Washington himself.
You've got to stop heating it up in a microwave. Buy yourselves a kettle and tea becomes a way of life. Yeah. Anyway, enough jibbing now, I suppose. The Americans, while resilient, were struggling with limited resources, internal division, and the daunting task of standing up against the world's most powerful military. Saratoga would change all of that. So let's get into the background and lead up to this historical clash.
So let's rewind a bit. It's 1777, and the American colonies have been in rebellion against British rule for over 2 years. The British plan for 1777 was ambitious. They aimed to split the colonies, like I said, by controlling the Hudson River.
Yeah. The idea was to isolate New England, seen as a hotbed of rebellion from the rest of the colonies. The plan involved a 3-pronged attack. General John Burgoyne, commanding British and German troops, would march south from Canada. Colonel Barry St. Ledger, leading British regulars, loyalists and Native American allies, would advance eastward from Lake Ontario. General William Howe was supposed to move north from New York City, but instead he chose to capture Philadelphia. But things didn't go exactly as planned. Howe's decision to divert to Philadelphia left Burgoyne to fend for himself in the wilderness of upstate New York. Burgoyne's progression was slow, and he faced numerous challenges. Burgoyne's main force consisted of the British 9th, 20th, 21st, 24th, and the 62nd Regiment of Foot Infantry, along with German mercenaries from Brunswick and Hesse-Hanau. His army also included Canadian militia and Native American allies, primarily Mohawk and Seneca warriors. In all, Burgoyne had about 7,200 troops, and Gates had 9,000 plus, another 2,000 showing up for the second battle. The numbers are always argued, but these are highly popular. Remember too that Burgoyne was just off the victory at Fort Ticonderoga, capturing the fort just miles north of Saratoga.
And by the way, the Mohawk River runs east-west just south of us in Schenectady, to give you an idea of how much influence the Native Americans have on us today, and rightly so. On the American side, General Horatio Gates commanded the Continental Army forces in the Northern Department. He was initially supported by Major General Philip Schuyler, who was instrumental in organizing the defenses, but later replaced by Gates just before the battles. Benedict Arnold, a skilled and aggressive officer, played a crucial role in the upcoming confrontations despite his contentious relationship with Gates. Gates relied heavily on Continental Army units such as the 2nd, 4th, and 13th Massachusetts Regiments, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd New Hampshire Regiments, the 2nd, 4th, and 8th New York Regiments as well. Additionally, militia units from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York contributed significantly to the American effort. And let's not forget about the local militia and volunteers who rallied to the American cause. These units, often referred to as the Green Mountain Boys, particularly from Vermont, under commanders like Seth Warner and John Stark, provided critical support with their knowledge of the terrain and their guerrilla tactics.
Another critical factor was the involvement of the Native American tribes. Burgoyne had enlisted support from several tribes, including the Mohawk, led by Joseph Brant, and the Seneca, led by Cornplanter. However, their presence also galvanized the American resistance, as settlers feared, and opposed their involvement in the conflict. This tension led to brutal skirmishes and heightened stakes for both sides.
It's also important to mention the impact of civilians. Many local settlers were caught in the crossfire. Their homes, farms, they became battlefields. Some supported the American cause, providing food, shelter, and intelligence. Others were loyalists, hoping for a British victory to restore their security.
Absolutely. The civilian population played a critical role in the logistics of the campaign. Local knowledge of the terrain, weather patterns, and hidden parts provided the American forces with a significant advantage. Civilians also contributed to the morale of the troops, with local support boosting the spirit of the American soldiers.
Speaking of weather, the autumn of 1777 brought significant challenges. The rainy season turned roads into quagmires, making the movement of troops and supplies incredibly difficult for Burgoyne's army. The cold and damp conditions sapped the strength of his soldiers and added to their misery. It was 48 degrees Fahrenheit at the Battle of Bemis Heights.
For us British, 48 degrees Fahrenheit is 8 Celsius. Anyway. For the Americans, the weather was both a challenge and an advantage. While it made fortifying positions and maintaining supply lines difficult, it also slowed the British advance and gave the Americans more time to prepare. The rain-soaked ground and the chilly air added to the sense of urgency and desperation on both sides as they prepared for the battle that would follow. All these elements set the stage for a confrontation that neither side could afford to lose. As Burgoyne's army approached Saratoga, the American forces prepared for a showdown that would determine the fate of the Northern campaign.
Here, it's worth noting the geography of Saratoga as well. The Hudson River Valley, with its rugged terrain and dense forests, presented significant challenges for any army moving through it. For Burgoyne, marching his troops through the difficult landscape added to his logistical nightmares. His supply lines were stretched thin, and American forces took advantage of the terrain to harass and slow his progress. The Americans knew the land well, and they used it to their advantage. The dense forest provided cover for guerrilla tactics, and the difficult terrain slowed the British advance, giving the Americans time to fortify their positions and gather reinforcements. As we move into the details of the battles, this understanding of the land will be crucial in appreciating the strategies employed by both sides.
Before we dive into the battles themselves, let's talk about the logistics. Burgoyne's army was well equipped, but burdened by an extensive baggage train, including a large number of artillery pieces. These slowed their march significantly. In contrast, the American forces were more mobile, with supply lines that were shorter and better protected by local militia. This logistical edge allowed the Americans to sustain their position and keep Burgoyne's forces under constant pressure.
The American forces also benefited from local support, which provided intelligence on British movements and helped coordinate attacks on supply convoys. The British, on the other hand, faced growing difficulties in maintaining their supply lines, leading to shortages of food and ammunition. This logistical strain was a key factor in the eventual outcome of the Saratoga campaign. Now, at this point, let me add a story about intelligence, that being my ballywick. that is a key to Saratoga. So at the time of the revolution, there was a guy named Alexander Bryan. He was a likable and trustworthy guy who owned a few taverns throughout the area here around Saratoga. One of those taverns was located 2 miles north of a town called Waterford, which is just south of Stillwater. Stillwater being the location of Saratoga's battlefield itself. The tavern was frequented by loyalists and rebels alike, and at one point, Bryan came across information that Burgoyne, while coming south along the Hudson, planned to attack at Saratoga. So Bryan immediately took this information to General Gates and provided him with as many details as he could. Gates was unaware of Burgoyne's plans at this point, as the story goes, and that Gates was able to prepare defense earlier than he would have without the information. Given this, some historians have gone as far as to say that Bryan was the only reason the Americans won and thereby saved the fight for independence. Now, it's a stretch to make that claim, probably, but he sure did help and just highlights the value of accurate and timely intelligence. Also, personally, for me, Bryan also owned another tavern just up the hill from a very famous spring called the High Rock Spring, right here in the city of Saratoga Springs. It's very much near General Schuyler's summer home. Nonetheless, this tavern eventually became, in some fashion, the current restaurant called the Old Bryan Inn. It is still there today, and in fact, I was a cook there in my youth for a few months. It's a great place with warm food and a warm atmosphere. Now, today's building was built in 1832, if I can recall correctly, which for us Americans is ancient. Anyway, an interesting appendage to our story, so if you will. Go ahead, Rob.
Additionally, the weather played a role. The autumn rain made an already challenging terrain even more difficult, turning roads into quagmires and complicating movement for Burgoyne's troops. This natural obstacle further delayed their progress and sapped their strength as they neared the American fortifications at Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga consisted of 2 main engagements: the Battle of Freeman's Farm on September the 19th, 1777, and the Battle of Brilliance Heights on October the 7th, 1777. And from what I hear, John, you're something of an expert.
Hey, listen, Rob, expert, certainly a stretch. I'm sure the brilliant employees over at the National Park Service would have something to say about whether I'm an expert or not. What I will say is that I visited the battlefield on a few different occasions in my youth and even as an adult, and I have done some reading, because it's so local and a connection to me. What I want to make clear, though, is the Battle of Saratoga is really 2 separate battles, just as you mentioned, Rob. Freeman's Farm in September and Bemis Heights in early October.
Yeah, the first was brutal for both sides, but particularly for Burgoyne and his men. Washington knew Burgoyne was heading south with the intent of splitting New England, and so sent Gates north to cut him off. Gates made it first and was able to set up a rather capable defence as he waited on the British. Burgoyne had just crossed the Hudson from east to west in an attempt to get a better view of Gates's army, but lost some of his Native American allies in doing so. Nonetheless, local loyalists and some Native Americans acted as scouts, providing vital intelligence. Burgoyne can see Gates and his deputy, Benedict Arnold, occupying the high ground to the south, and decided to attack directly at Gates to pin him in place, while he's sending flanking manoeuvre to the west of Gates and then back east to pin Gates against the Hudson.
At the same time, Arnold, a brilliant general in his own right, even though an eventual traitor, pleads with Gates to let him take a contingent of men north to meet Burgoyne before Burgoyne can attack Gates. Gates finally relents, and Arnold races north and meets the British at Freeman's Farm, while Gates occupies Bemis Heights to the south. Now, the battlefield itself was a mixture of open fields and dense forest, with the American forces utilizing the cover and concealment to launch surprise attacks and skirmishes. This made it difficult for Burgoyne's troops to maintain formation and respond effectively.
We're going to take a little break here, but don't fret, here's more of the Swerve Podcast.
Break free from the ordinary and check out a podcast with thought-shattering concepts that will reshape the way you interpret the world.
We are the Swerve Podcast, and our mission is very simple. Each episode, we research and discuss topics that swerve off the mainstream path in an attempt to understand everything in the universe, one obscure topic at a time.
Whether you're into forgotten history, cutting-edge science, strange frontiers of the unknown, or just need a good laugh in an uncensored way, the Swerve Podcast has you covered.
Listen to the Swerve Podcast today on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any other major platforms.
Welcome back. Imagine being a soldier in the thick of it. You're standing in the middle of a clearing. The ground is uneven and littered with rocks and fallen branches. To your left and right, the forest is dense, its shadows hiding enemy soldiers, ready to ambush. The air is thick with the smoke of musket fire, and the noise is deafening. Shouts, gunshots, and the clash of bayonets.
You could see the fear and determination in the faces of your comrades as you push forward, the terrain slowing your advance and making it hard to keep your footing. Every step is a struggle, every moment a battle for survival. Simply brutal to contemplate.
So both armies meet at the farm and push against each other's lines for hours and hours. Sometimes the Americans gain the edge, other times the British. Both Burgoyne and Gates led specific attacks from the front, demonstrating unquestionable bravery. As the days drag on, a group of Hessians, led by General Riedzel, receive orders to join the melee. He brought his soldiers from the east and attacked the right flank of the Americans.
General Gates refuses to send more troops, as Arnold requested, and finally, as the sun begins to set, the Americans are pushed from the field by the British. But unfortunately for the British, they cannot exploit their success because night had fallen. War in the 1700s simply wasn't fought at night. It was nearly impossible to see what you were doing, and in some circles wasn't considered even gentlemanly. Either was guerrilla warfare, but that's another discussion.
Freeman's Farm was a tactical win for the British. They did push the Americans from the battlefield, but a strategic victory for the Americans because it weakened Burgoyne's forces significantly and stopped Burgoyne from reaching Albany, his main goal. Burgoyne lost nearly 600 men, dead, wounded and captured, and Gates approximately 300. After the inconclusive battle at Freeman's Farm, Burgoyne dug in and awaited reinforcements that never came. His supply lines were stretched thin and morale deteriorated. The Americans, however, were riding high after the battle, knowing how much damage they had incited. Then came the Battle of Bemis Heights.
So now we have a break, a timeout, if you will. Both armies are hunkered down, they're dug in, and lick their respective wounds. One important note to mention here regarding the stalemate, both Burgoyne and Gates fought bravely, but both made similar mistakes. They both neglected to concentrate their forces and exploit success when the opportunities arose during the day. If Burgoyne merged his three initial columns into one, he would have been able to pierce Gates's line and defeat the Americans cleanly. The same is true for Gates, who again ignored Arnold when he suggested bringing reinforcements to pressure the British weakened center during the mid-afternoon. Two well-respected leaders failing in similar ways that day.
Now we turn to what is considered a strategic mistake, at least in terms of what's happening at Saratoga. Burgoyne received news that General Clinton is coming north along the Hudson through New York to bolster Burgoyne. With that, Burgoyne digs in and waits. Unfortunately for Burgoyne, General Howe, the British senior commander, diverts Clinton to Philadelphia instead because he wants Clinton to help him occupy the American capital and home of the Continental Congress. The problem? Burgoyne needs help at Saratoga and New York, which is where Howe originally planned to go. Much a better target. Capturing Philadelphia meant little.
Nevertheless, Burgoyne must do something. He can't sit in Saratoga. His men are leaving daily. It's cold, it's wet, and morale is dropping precipitously. He contemplates retreating to Ticonderoga, but realizes his slow-moving army is vulnerable to rearguard actions. He finally decides on October 7th to test Gates' western flank again in an attempt to fight through to Albany.
but instead of a reconnaissance to identify Gates's disposition, followed by a full counterattack or retreat, depending on what he learned. Burgoyne's troops ended up in the full-scale combat against the Americans.
The terrain here was even more advantageous for the Americans, with fortified positions on the high ground overlooking the British encampment. This time, with the Americans having thousands more forces at hand, eventually began to crush the British lines in the late afternoon.
General Arnold, despite being relieved of command, charged onto the battlefield and led a bold assault that broke the British defences. He boldly flanked to his right and began to collapse the British left end of the line. His knowledge of the terrain and his audacious tactics turned the tide in favour of the Americans.
At Bemis Heights, the American fortifications were impressive. Imagine standing on a ridge, looking down at the British forces below. The high ground gives you a clear view of the enemy's movements, and the fortifications provide cover from incoming fire.
The Americans used the terrain masterfully. From their elevated position, they could see every move the British made. When Arnold led the charge, it was down steep, wooded slopes, taking the British by surprise and driving them back.
Arnold's actions at Bemis Heights were nothing short of heroic. He ignored orders to stay out of the fight, and against all odds led his troops to key positions, driving the British back and securing a crucial victory. At one point, while directing the fight against British General Byron at the last redoubt, he is shot in the leg and tells his troops he wished it had been in the heart so he can die a hero in battle.
The battlefield at Bemis Heights was a mix of steep ridges and dense woods, making it a challenging environment for the British, who were already worn down by previous skirmishes and low supplies. They had little food and, in hindsight, should have left for Canada when they had the chance, after discovering General Clinton wasn't coming.
Burgoyne's army was forced to retreat, and within days they found themselves completely surrounded. Food and cannon were taken. The British lost almost 900 dead, wounded, and captured, to the Americans approximately 200. Burgoyne had numerous war councils to decide on what to do next. Most agree that surrender was the only option. Gates wanted it to end quickly, as Clinton was now headed toward Albany. With no hope of a relief, Burgoyne surrendered on October 17, 1777.
The surrender at Saratoga was monumental. Over 5,000 British and Hessian troops were captured, a staggering blow to the British military effort.
And the terms of the surrender were generous. Burgoyne's men were allowed to return to England, provided they didn't fight in North America again. However, the Congress refused to ratify these terms, and the prisoners remained in captivity for the duration of the war. Many died of disease, while others escaped to start lives in America.
Let's take a moment to consider the personal experiences of the soldiers and officers on both sides of these battles. Imagine the exhaustion and anxiety of Burgoyne's men, stranded in hostile territory with dwindling supplies. They were far from home, surrounded by dense forests that concealed the enemy, and every moment forward was fraught with danger.
And for the American soldiers, the stakes were incredibly high. They were fighting not just for survival, but for the very idea of independence. The sight of their fellow soldiers, determined and resolute, must have been a powerful motivator. The terrain, while challenging, also provided a sense of familiarity and strategic advantage.
From the dense forests of Freeman's Farm to the high ground of Bemis Heights, the natural landscape played a critical role in shaping the strategies and outcomes of these battles. The Americans' ability to use the terrain to their advantage was a testament to their adaptability and determination.
These battles were more than just clashes of armies. They were tests of endurance, strategy, and the will to fight for a cause. The legacy of Saratoga is not just in the strategic victory, but in the resilience and courage displayed by those who fought there.
The immediate aftermath of Saratoga was felt across the globe. The American victory convinced the French to enter the war as an ally of the United States, providing critical military and financial support. And let's be clear about the French's intentions here. Yes, they were now convinced supporting America was a winning choice and believed the colonies deserved independence. But they were most interested in dealing a blow to the British, who did heavy damage to the French forces during the 7 Years' War.
Now, it's true, Rob. Now, let's not think the French joined because of some fawning love for America. That certainly wasn't the case. Nonetheless, French involvement was a game changer. It turned a colonial rebellion into a global conflict, stretching British resources thin and opening new fronts. The deal, details of which were agreed upon by Benjamin Franklin and France's foreign minister, the Count of Vergennes, was eventually signed in February 1778. The most help came particularly in the maritime domain. The American colonies had very little naval capabilities, but that was not the case with the French. Now, given French naval power, they could create supply blockades that would devastate the British.
For Britain, Saratoga marked a turning point in their strategy. Realising they couldn't simply crush the rebellion with brute force, they began focusing more on the southern colonies, hoping to rally loyalist support there. They also hoped to garner slave support, which sounds a bit strange given how America's southerners would no doubt prevent that from happening. The British won a few victories in Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, but ultimately to little avail. Simply put, there was not as many loyalists in the South as was believed, and pressure to join the British cause eventually pushed many independents to join the cause for independence.
And on the American side, Saratoga boosted morale and legitimized the Continental Army in the eyes of many skeptics. It also propelled leaders like Benedict Arnold into the spotlight, though his story would take a dramatic turn later on.
Indeed, but that's a story for another episode. The significance of Saratoga cannot be overstated. It was a victory that reshaped the war and paved the way for American independence.
The victory also had profound effects on the international stage. It demonstrated that the Americans could stand toe-to-toe with the British Army and win. This emboldened other nations to consider supporting the American cause, knowing that the Americans were capable of achieving significant victories.
The French support was not just in the form of military aid, but also financial assistance and naval power, which would be critical in later battles, particularly in the Siege of Yorktown. French troops and ships played a decisive role in the final victory over the British.
And let's not forget the impact on the soldiers who fought at Saratoga. The victory instilled a sense of pride and confidence in the Continental Army. It proved that with determination and strategy and the right leadership, they can overcome one of the most formidable military forces in the world.
For General Burgoyne, the defeat was a personal and professional disaster. He returned to Britain in disgrace, his military career effectively over. He spent the rest of his life arguing for his decisions and never commanded again. He did continue in politics, eventually making Commander-in-Chief of Ireland, joining the Privy Council before dying unexpectedly in 1792. Overall, the British government had reassessed its approach to the war, leading to changes in leadership and strategy. The American victory at Saratoga also had a ripple effect on public opinion in Britain. There was a growing war weariness and opposition to the conflict among the British public and politicians. The war was costly and increasingly seen unwinnable.
As for General Horatio Gates, he tried to use Saratoga as a springboard for more power. He hated and was jealous of General Washington. So he lobbied Congress and was eventually placed in a position of higher civilian rank than Washington as president of the Board of War, which was really administrative, but remained a lower military rank. This was clearly a conflict of interest that infuriated Washington. Gates was eventually caught speaking ill of Washington behind his back in something called the Conway Cabal, apologized and resigned from the board, then went south to be routed at Camden by General Cornwallis.
Saratoga stands as a testament to the power of resolve and strategic ingenuity. It was a pivotal moment that showcased the importance of alliance and the impact of terrain and local knowledge in military strategy.
Now, let's do a few questions that I think would be of interest to our listeners. I'll go first, okay? What do you remember in school about the American Revolution, and how did it compare to the other military lessons you were taught?
To be quite honest, not a great deal. We were probably taught more about the American Civil War, but only at higher education level. I'm talking maybe GCSE level, which is like our high school, end of high school tests. And that's it. If you chose it, it wasn't guaranteed. Most of what I've learned has been as I've got older, and it doesn't just go for America, Britain, that's Britain included. I'm interested to know what you guys learn about our history, if at all.
I'd say we learn a decent amount. Of course, we focus on American history, but colonialism, not just British, is key. I'd also say the World Wars, Churchill, whom I love, by the way, and Thomas Edward Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence, whom I also love. He's one of my favorite historical characters. I'd say the colonialism topic is most prominent. We Americans like to chirp about not being a colonial power, Woodrow Wilson, 14 points and stuff, even though we have our own issues meddling throughout the 20th century. That's clear. How about a dark history detail? Did anything happen during Saratoga that you would consider a part of dark history, speaking about your podcast?
Unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, there wasn't. But during the war, there were quite a few massacres. The first is the Cherry Valley Massacre, and it was an attack by British and Iroquois forces on the fort of the town of Cherry Valley in central New York on November the 11th, 1778. A mixed force of loyalists, British soldiers, Seneca, and Mohawks descended on Cherry Valley, whose defenders, despite warnings, were unprepared for the attack. During the raid, the Seneca, in particular, targeted non-combatants, and reports state that 30 such individuals were killed, in addition to several army defenders. Also, there was the Ganattenhoughton Massacre, also known as Moravian Massacre, was the killing of 97 pacifist Moravian Christian Indians, primarily Lenapes or Mohicans, by US militiamen from Pennsylvania, under the command of David Williamson, on March the 8th, 1782. And finally, the Long Run Massacre occurred on the 13th of September, 1781, at the intersection of Floyd Fork Creek, also Falls Trace, a trail in what is now eastern Jefferson County, Kentucky. A day earlier, settlers at Painted Stone Station, established by Squire Boone, who was an American frontiersman, had learned that the fort was about to be raided by a large Indian war party under the command of the loyalist captain Alexander McKay. Most chose to abandon the station for a better defended one, near Burgrass Creek, and had left the injured Boone and one other family behind. Some settlers hesitated for 2 days before moving to Lynn Station. Following the loss of part of their military guard, the party was ambushed at 13 Mile Tree, 8 miles or 13 kilometres from Lynn Station. At least 7 settlers were killed. Indian losses were unknown. I must admit I've been enthralled by your, shall we say, mini-series on Iraq. How did you feel in country?
Oh, well, thanks for the question, Rob. Thankfully, I can say I wasn't party to or witness to any massacres like you had just stated, so that's a good thing. How did I feel? This is going to sound like a cop-out, but I did have many different feelings. At first, I was anxious to get started. There were certainly some hesitation, not to actually go, but of the unknown, really. My friends and I tried to talk to as many soldiers as we could who had deployed before, but it didn't really help. It was too early in the rotations. 2005 was when I went, and it began in 2003, really to get a sense of what was happening. I can't say I was ever scared. Now, let me make clear that this isn't because I'm some kind of a maniac or tough guy, right? Ask my wife. I'm far from that. It's just that your mission seems to take precedent, and you don't have the time. It was the same for me during my time as an organized crime investigator. Sitting on a dark street in gang territory never bothered me in the moment. It was only after I left the job when I started to realize what I was doing. I do recall one time in Kuwait, before we ever left for Iraq, during pre-training, watching videos of recent IED explosions that were designed to prepare us to react to contact, I did get a little nervous. It started to hit me that we weren't in Kansas anymore, if you get the analogy. I had friends who were injured and some passed, as I mentioned in the series, but it just doesn't hit you in the moment. Was I relieved to leave? Yes. But because I was tired, not because I was afraid. I just wanted to go home and sleep, really. Let me also say that while we were certainly in a kinetic area, mortars and rockets were constantly landing in our work and our living areas, I wasn't on the streets every day. Right? I didn't deal with the daily threat of IEDs and vehicle-borne IEDs or truck bombs or kick doors and clear houses. That just wasn't my job. I was an intel guy. Maybe I'd feel differently, though, if that was the case. But again, Rob, I appreciate the question.
I think it's amazing how much wars impact history. Take today's subject, for example. The men that fought in this would never have envisaged that 200 years later, two people from opposite sides of the battle and world would be talking about it still. With the Iraq War, it's really interesting to sit and talk to someone who's lived it. Because in another 200 years, it could be still being spoken about. Who knows, maybe your episodes on it could be in a museum somewhere.
I appreciate you saying that because I do feel that we often miss, or let's just say that I do. I miss the historical implications of events in the moment. I'll give you Afghanistan as a certain example. So I was younger when I went to Iraq in 2005. I was obviously a bit older in 2012 when I went to Afghanistan. I was married. I had a kid. I had 2 kids, as a matter of fact, at that point. And I just remember being so engrossed in my work. I didn't pay a lot of attention to like taking pictures or writing things down or being connected to the time and to the event. But now that I look back on it in 2024, I think to myself, wait a minute. I was in Kandahar. I was in the birthplace of the Taliban. I was in a city. Now, I didn't spend a lot of time downtown, but I was in a place where history from thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago was made, and it just never really connected to me in the moment, and I should have paid more attention. And so your point about having this conversation after the Iraq War and then somebody listening in 200 years, I joke that who would really want to listen, but maybe they really would. So I appreciate it, just you bringing up that context.
I always feel that in the moment of history, you're just thinking about your daily life. Nobody thinks further on ahead in time, and that what we're doing now is going to be somebody's history in hundreds of years' time. So yeah, that was just waffling.
No, that's a great point. All right, let's reflect. Let's wrap up. Let's reflect on the legacy of Saratoga. It was not just a military victory, as we had discussed earlier, but a moment that galvanized a nation and changed the course of history. The bravery and sacrifices of those who fought at Saratoga continue to inspire us today.
Absolutely, Jon. Saratoga reminds us that turning points in history are often a result of many factors coming together. Leadership, strategy, courage, and sometimes a bit of luck. It's these moments that shape the future and define our past.
Okay, thank you for joining us on this journey through the Battle of Saratoga. We hope you gained a deeper understanding of its significance and the incredible stories of those that were there.
I suppose we better mention our channels and also where to find them. If by some miracle I haven't alienated myself from the American public, for Jon's audience, my show Dark History can be found on any of your preferred podcast providers. We normally dive headfirst into the more macabre side of history that isn't widely spoken about. I cover everything from wars and massacres to botched executions and terrible people, and everything in between. You can also find me on most social media and Patreon, but I doubt anybody likes me enough to pay. What about yourself, Jon?
Yeah. For our listeners on the other side of the pond, you can catch headlines in history like Dark History on all the major podcast outlets. You can also visit headlinesinhistory.com to see the website that I have. I have contacts there and interview requests. I even have a donation page. I try to live in the space for those that are interested in foreign affairs and military conflict along with their histories. but for those who don't want to really read a book about it, if you will. So I usually say, for those that want more of the nightly news, but not a whole college course. I don't always stick to the headlines and history model perfectly, but nonetheless, that's my goal. Thanks, Rob.
No worries. Before we sign off, I just want to thank Jon for working with me over the last few months on this, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
No, I think we should, and I think we will. So thanks for joining me, Rob, and I really appreciate it, and we'll certainly be in touch.
Thank you. See you later, Jon.